Welcome to the closing session of the 55th Annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust and Churches, the longest running academic conference, scholars conference on the Holocaust. Indeed, many say that the field of Holocaust studies began in 1970 when Franklin Littell and Hubert Locke convened the first. I have the great blessing of working with at the Ackerman Center here at UT Dallas, and I have an even greater blessing of introducing my dear friend of about 40 years or so, Dr. Alan Berger, who is the Raddock Family Eminent Scholar Chair of Holocaust Studies at Florida Atlantic University. He is this year's recipient of the Eternal Flame Award, which is to my right over here on the table. And I can think of no one who represents everything that the eternal flame, the Ner Tamid, as we call it in synagogue, more thoroughly, more profoundly than Alan Berger. Alan is going to speak today about identity, trauma, and memory, third-generation Holocaust representation. Alan Berger is one of the genuine authorities on second generation, third generation. He has a very important book called Children of Job, for example. He has, among his many books, I've had the pleasure of working with Professor Berger on a couple of books myself. Earlier today, Richard Leibowitz, another veteran scholar here at the Scholars Conference, mentioned a few of the individuals who have passed through this conference, such as Elie Wiesel, Richard Rubenstein, Yehuda Bauer, Franklin Littell, of course, Harry James Kargas, Michael Berenbaum, all of the prominent and famous scholars in Holocaust studies. And in that company, certainly in that league, is Alan Berger. I can think of no one more suited to address this closing session and to send us all on our way with the memory testimony to remember and preserve, remember and watch over Zachor v'Shamor. So please join me to welcome Alan L. Berger.
I would like to just start out by thanking the benefactors of this lecture and recall some of the names that were mentioned by Rick Leibowitz, especially Harry James Kargas, who used to write me messages addressed to Veggie Burger, and I appreciated that very much. I also would like to acknowledge here Rick Leibowitz, Franklin and Marcy Littell, of course, David Patterson, who I regard as an unparalleled teacher and mentor. And I also want to say that late last night, late for me, probably 9 o'clock, I got a message from John Roth, a distinguished professor who has written, along with Carol, what is Carol's last? Rittner, Sister Carol Rittner, a book called Stress Test, which has to do with the situation in the Middle East and its implications for Christian-Jewish relations. So this book has just come out, and I would recommend it to everybody here. It's called Stress Test. Now, here is my presentation. I begin with the obvious. Questions define the Jewish historical experience. From the exiles wondering how they could sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. By the way, more than a few of these exiles chose to stay in culturally superior Babylonia rather than to return to their ancestral homeland. Rabbinic literature, for its part, is full of questions ranging from property laws through various midrashim seeking to respond to the why question. Why do we still study the meaning of an eye for an eye? Why do we not see the kid in its mother's milk? What does the tale of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa teach? Why was God apparently indifferent to Jewish suffering during the Holocaust? Now, there are responses to all of these questions, which I won't go into here. Perhaps the most perplexing contemporary how is how to remain Jewish in a post-Holocaust universe. Aside from survivors themselves, no single group has responded with more rigor than the third generation. Grandchildren of survivors. The passage of 80 years has only sharpened the insight of Elie Wiesel, who, addressing these generations, observed, "We do not live in the past, but the past lives in us." What do you do with something that you never experienced, but who informs the core of your being? It has not been too long ago, measured by the arc of history, that Helen Epstein, author of the pioneering work Children of the Holocaust, was told by a New York Times editor that there was no such thing as an identifiable second generation. Epstein's book turned out to be the Bible of the second generation movement. I have no idea what became of the ill-informed New York Times editor. Perhaps he works for the New York Post. I don't know. The contemporary why question is asked in a highly charged environment. History itself appears up for grabs. Lying has become commonplace. The rise and spread of anti-Semitism, including a gutter type of language, is published under the banner of free speech. Holocaust denial and trivialization appear daily, written by those who would be happy to have seen or rejoice over the Shoah's claim of success. Vilification of Israel, the Jew among the nations, is made much of in the contemporary press. Otherwise respectable press, for example, the BBC, is more than shameful. And lest we forget, the beating and murder of Jews, even in America, the presumed Golden Medina, has dispelled the last of the Enlightenment myths. Remember the murders in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania, and Poway, California. But journalists insist on keeping an open mind. The problem with that insistence is that frequently, if your mind is too open, your brains fall out. This why question could clearly occupy our attention for a long time, but this afternoon I want to direct our attention to several theoretical studies and 4 third-generation artistic works in order to explore this issue further. In our time, perhaps the most vexing question is how to understand the third generation works. What do they mean? What's at stake? Eva Hoffman, a Polish-born daughter of survivors, offers her own commentary on the second generation identity. Those who live after such knowledge, in her phrase, are charged with a special obligation. Hoffman observes of the complex relationship between past and present, and seeking to understand the relationship between the two areas. The inheritors of trauma, traumatic historical experience, the ability to separate the past from the present. She sees the past as the war, not her birth, her own birth, but the war. Her childhood is the war. I wanted to know the people in it engaged, not from the biological birth, but from the war. That was the beginning of her experience. Over the past 30 years, there have been a proliferation of Holocaust representation, novels, memoirs, and film by grandchildren of survivors. The issue for the theorists of the third generation is simply put, the third generation, to cite the late theologian Arthur Cohn, bears the scar without the wound. They inherit something they didn't experience. Very few in the third generation have living memories of their survivor grandparents. Rather, their memories of survivors are mediated through the recollection of tales told them by the second generation, their parents. But these tales are often incomplete. Let me now turn to three theorists. Gerd Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R, as a cinema critic. He makes a highly helpful observation concerning the third generation. As time moves away from World War II, he writes, memory takes on a different quality as it becomes transformed from direct witnessing and the resulting testimonial to archival and mediated forms of remembering that carry the responsibility of firmly embedding the Holocaust in the cultural memory of later generations. What do you do with the inheritance when you didn't know the people who experienced the trauma, although you did know your parents, more or less, the second generation? He concludes by saying that memory defines the paradigm shift and this generational move from survivor writing to second generation witnessing to the transmission of memory by the third generation. Bayer emphasizes the distinction between Marianne Hirsch, who is a theorist of what she calls post-memory, and Eva Hoffman's after such knowledge. What do you do with such knowledge? On the one hand, Hirsch's post-memory defines itself through a sense of belatedness that puts the 0 degree of memory in the moment of trauma. So for Marianne Hirsch, post-memory is what happens, the experience of what happens on the shoulders of the third generation. Born, she says, with 0 knowledge of what happened. On the other hand, Hoffman's after such knowledge firmly holds on to the present and looks for the place of memory within everyday life. Memory of trauma after such knowledge places the past alongside other aspects of life in order to guarantee its place in the cultural memory. The post-memory changes additional generation comes to the exposed in its remembered content. In other words, the third generation has to ask itself, why should I remember? What is it I'm remembering but not remembering, but having been told these tales? What do I do with this information? The challenge for the third generation, as Daniel Mendelsohn insightfully notes in his award-winning memoir, The Lost, A Search for the Six of the 6 Million, is to negotiate between proximity and distance. They're close to their parents, but very distant from the event. And like any inheritance, it has to come to grips with. There are shared characteristics, moreover, and this is a shocker, between descendants of survivors and of perpetrators. Both were silent, although for different reasons. Perpetrators preferred to forget they were either murderers or bystanders, or those who remained indifferent as their former neighbors were rounded up and shipped off to be exterminated. The children of survivors, the second generation, frequently refrained from asking questions because they didn't want to hurt their parents. The parents, on the other hand, frequently refrained from talking about their experience because they didn't want to hurt their children. So there you have the perfect dilemma. How do you pass down an inheritance that transcends generations and chronological boundaries and requires bearing witness? How is trauma received and transmitted? Well, you all remember when you skinned your knee as a child, or you hurt your hand, or whatever. How does one reclaim a memory not one's own? That's the basic question for the third generation. How do you reclaim a memory that is not yours? Dominic Lacapra writes, the Shoah and its attendant phenomena constitute a traumatic series of events of which we are still attempting to come to grips. One job of history is to work through a past that is not past. Work through a past that is not past. We can study World War II, we can study the camps. They've passed. World War II as an historical event has a definite beginning and a definite end. Its traumatic legacy, however, is still with us. And once it gets out into the public, there's no telling what will happen to it. Well, there is a telling, unhappily. It's distorted, trivialized, lied about. Not a good situation. To return to Gerd Bayer, the cinema critic, as time moves on from World War II, memory takes on a different quality. From direct witness to archival and mediated forms of remembrance. And here I think with the connection to technology, the computer has been a very helpful device in the third generation search for family, friends of family, finding out what resources are available. These are quests for meaning, and the computer can be quite helpful. As every scholar knows, and everybody else knows, it cuts down the time for research. What used to be, in the age of the encyclopedia, hours and hours of reading and dozing and things like that, has been reduced to minutes by the computer. So in that sense, it's very good. And the third generation has put its efforts into this form of research. But I think that the internet is also a source of great problems. There is no quality control in the computer industry. You look at X, for example, which used to be Twitter, which used to be gossip. And what can you find on X? Anything you want. There is no quality control. There is no guarantee of truth or approximate truth. What we have nowadays is a situation that is ripe for misuse. Denial, trivialization, all of this is with us too much. As a matter of fact, it's gotten so bad that one Palestinian murderer of Jews who's in an Israeli prison wrote about herself that she feels like Anne Frank. I mean, you don't know where to begin critiquing this, but this is what happens when the information is out in public with no prior knowledge or deliberate attempt to evade any responsibility. So here we have the situation. What's the role of technology in all of this? In 1999, Nava Semo, an Israeli novelist, published a novel called And the Rat Laughed. The heroine of this story is a grandmother now living in Tel Aviv who survived sexual assaults as she was hidden in an underground area by an anti-Semitic Polish couple. The reason they hid her is they got paid. As soon as the money ran out, they threw her out. The hero of that part of her story is a priest who saved the young girl's life. Now, the grandmother lives in Tel Aviv, as I mentioned, and her job is to protect her Israeli granddaughter from finding out what really happened to her during the war. So she invents the story of a rat who became her friend. But beyond that, the issue is like this. A priest rescues her, saves her life. Semo was very interested in Jewish-Christian relations, studied it in Tel Aviv University. I had the pleasure of meeting her when my wife Naomi and I were in Tel Aviv one summer. And she was a very powerful personality. And she said that when her book came out in 1999, it was just on the eve of the technological revolution. But the grandmother, the survivor, was able to impress her granddaughter's friends because she knew how to use the computer. So she was okay. She was one of them. That's one of the early uses of computers in Holocaust research that I'm aware of, at least, in these books. Important is what Professor Vicky Ahrens calls the quest narrative. Quest narrative means returning to the towns or villages where the survivors lived, computer searches, questioning of friends of the family. All of this comprises an attempt to answer the question, what do I do with this knowledge? How does it inform me? How can I move forward with my life? And I have to move forward. And what place does this inherited traumatic memory play? What role does it play in my life? And I want to talk about some contemporary examples. One of the earliest among the Israeli third generation was Arnon Goldfinger, who made a film called The Flat, a Dirah. And in this film, he talks about his mother and himself after the passing of the grandparents. The mother, the second generation, went up to the flat and started collecting what she termed garbage and throwing the garbage bags over the railing so they could be collected and removed. The son, the third generation, says, in effect, no, we have to go through all of this material. So what did he discover? His grandparents were friends with a high-ranking German official who was on the staff of Adolf Eichmann. And after the war, his grandparents resumed their friendship with this man. Although as Eichmann's adjutant, you can imagine what kind of things he participated in. The story moves on when he goes to meet the daughter of the high-ranking Nazi. She greets him effusively, wants to be friends, and refuses his tale in which he tells her that her father was a Nazi. Then she, in effect, shuts down, doesn't want to have any further thing to do with the filmmaker. The filmmaker subsequently goes to various camps, records his impressions, and an official from Yad Vashem thanks him for his film because he said, well, we didn't know what to do. We thought the transmission of the story was over with the second generation, but it's not. It continues. And his film was very important, still important. Another novelist is a woman named Johanna Adorjan. She's a German journalist whose father was in the Holocaust, but he since converted from Judaism, and he rarely, if ever, talks about his experience. One day they go to Mauthausen together, and she is horrified because on a mandatory school trip to the camps, a group of 14-year-old students, inappropriately dressed, talking on their cell phones, laughing and having a good time, she says they have no idea what happened here. Moreover, they don't care. And Dorjan identifies with the Jewish people to the extent that one of her friends suggests that she tried to go on J-date. So she does. And she gets in contact with a man, goes to meet him in a cafe, and he represented himself as a 35-year-old person. So she walks into the cafe, she sees him and thinks, well, yes, he used to be 35 approximately 30 years ago. So that didn't go anywhere, but she learned a lot, I suppose. Moreover, she was the daughter of people who later on committed suicide because they couldn't stand to live without each other. Her father was terminally ill, and they viewed themselves as having had 3 births. One was their biological birth. 2 was their birth after World War II. And 3 was the time they spent in Denmark, where essentially they went to commit suicide. So Adorjan has a very mixed identity. However, she identifies wholeheartedly with the Jewish people. And she talks about her experience of being on an El Al flight and identifying with the passengers who were speaking Hebrew and Yiddish and English, and with whom she felt at home, much more at home than with her other biological family. So what can we say? We know that the 3rd generation is seeking an identity. But what does identity mean in a postmodern world where there are all kinds of factors that go to make up one's identity? One of the issues is intermarriage. One of the issues is, should I live in Israel? Another issue is, what do I do for a living? Do I identify with the Jewish people? Do I help them, or do I ignore them, or do they just exist? And that's it. Now, Julie Oranger, who's an established novelist, wrote a book called The Flight Portfolio. Has anyone heard of that? If you haven't, you should write it down and read it. Because her response was to concentrate on the figure of Varian Fry. Who is Varian Fry? Anyway, you know. Yeah, yeah. Varian Fry was an American, an intellectual, who went to Marseille so he could help intellectuals escape, including Hannah Arendt and others. Now, he was supposed to stay there for a very short period of time, stayed for almost 2 years, and helped in the rescue of many, many people. There is a passage in the book where a State Department official tells Varian Fry, and please, no more goddamn Jews in America. That was the official policy of the State Department during the war. Varian Fry ignored him, belittled him, and in the end was responsible for the rescue of over 1,000 people, maybe twice that number. He had money given him by the government. He had the good sense to assemble a staff which was also committed to this project. He lived in a hotel, and he interviewed people who needed to escape or else they were dead. Now, he had several factors against him: the Vichy government, the Nazis, and of course the US State Department. Nevertheless, he persevered, he succeeded. Varian Fry was also a homosexual. What Julie Oranger did was to combine the historical figure of Varian Fry with his imagined lover, Grant, who was a professor at Columbia University. I noticed that Columbia was recently in the news for not a good reason. I'm glad their money was withheld because they've been for many years against a certain ethnic group. Now, the people who protested Israel's action in defending itself, Saul Bellow calls them high IQ morons. No, I think probably the morons is more important than the high IQ. I wonder about the IQ of somebody who says, in effect, your enemy wants to kill you, let's sit down and talk. You just don't do that if you want to stay alive. This is not to say that everything that Israel does is correct, far from it. But it's a state like any other state that has a right to exist. So, what's the upshot of this story? The upshot is that Varian Fry was denied any credit for what he did by the U.S. State Department until Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, many years later, acknowledged what Fry did and its importance. But it took many years, many years, too many years. The other thing I want to mention is, and some of you probably have seen, did you see the Netflix film Unorthodox? Well, Unorthodox tells the story of Etsy, who is a third generation person and moves from Monsey in New York State to Berlin, where she falls in with a group who are Jews, but not only Jews, and who make jokes about the Holocaust. She feels very uneasy about that, but nonetheless feels liberated by being out of the Orthodox, neo-Orthodox, no, Orthodox community. I think that what we need to bear in mind is that the third generation is trying to define itself in a way that enables it to live in the present but not forget the legacy of the past. It's a very difficult job to do. And I think that the third generation collectively is responsible for maintaining Jewish identity, whether it's religious or non-religious, mostly non-religious. But they come back to the key question, who am I after this trauma happened to my grandparents? What can I say about being a Jew, about being an American, or being a Australian, or being a German? And there was a book written about the third generation in which people from 8 different countries were interviewed. These were our third generation people. Some have a great deal of bitterness toward Germany and the German people. Others are more interested in some form of reconciliation. But, and there's always a but here, there is the lingering trauma of what happened. You can't erase that. It defines you. The issue here is, how do you move forward with your life with that fact in your life? It's not a simple thing to do. But if there's any group that is committed to trying to do this, it's the third generation. Perhaps the leaven in the lump, so to speak. Will they succeed? Who knows? Probably the odds are stacked against them. But there's a book called The Ever-Dying People, in which the author says each generation of Jews is convinced that it is the last, that the generation before them was much better, more informed, more Jewishly knowledgeable, and they're sure that they're the last. So far, that book has no other conclusion. It keeps being written, and let's hope it always will be. Thank you very much. So I guess we have time for observations, questions, whatever. if you're so inclined. Okay. Oh, and among the many things I forgot was to acknowledge and appreciate Dean Niels Romer for his leadership of this conference. So,
Yeah, my question, sorry, I'll stand up. Sorry, my question for you is how can we, so I'm one of the few students here today, how can we continue the legacy and continue remembering the Holocaust when for us it seems so out of reach and so far in our ancestors' past, but still, like you said, relevant to our identity today?
what's the next question? No, it's a very good question. How can you do that? Well, you know, some people study dinosaurs. That happened a long time ago. And I gather by looking around the room that none of us have dinosaur ancestors. So I think, how do you do it? Well, those in the third generation are telling us. It's not clear cut. It's not say, well, if you do X and Y, you're gonna be okay. How do you feel about yourself? How do you feel about being Jewish, or non-Jewish for that matter? This is what the third generation collectively is trying to put out on the table. Why should I care? But I do care. How can I help but care? But on the other hand, I've got to lead my life. I'm living now, not then. Again, Elie Wiesel's comment, we don't live in the past, but the past lives in us. It's true, like many things he said. Absolutely true. How do you live with the past living inside you? That's something that every human being should take seriously, especially the Jewish people. Some analysts have said, well, a history of Judaism, a history of disaster and recuperation from disaster. Sad but true, but I think it's a generalization which unhappily David Ben-Gurion made popular when he said the diaspora was a 2,000-year parenthesis in Jewish history, ignoring the great period of poets, scholars, and contributors to world history on the part of Jews and Judaism. So we're much more than a trauma, but we dare not forget the trauma, and the trauma has us, so we deal with it. More questions? Yes.
Oh, hi. One thing I feel is that, you know, my father was a survivor of the Holocaust, but I didn't live through it. But I did live through 10/7 as a witness to what was going on over there. And it was not just so horrific, but what was so horrific was the initial silence everywhere. And so, you know, in a sense, I feel like I'm a new first generation of actually witnessing some aspect of that horror. And so, you know, I think it helps push the responsibility, or makes me feel responsible to actually make a difference. So maybe you could just comment on what that might do for the fourth generation.
Yeah, you know, fourth generation aside for 1 minute, among the second generation, some people refuse this legacy. Usually one person in the family was designated as the official representative of the trauma. Some people rejected it, some people were indifferent to it. What do we do with the fourth generation? Well, how do we teach our children? There probably are as many answers to that as there are people in this room. How do we teach our children? What do we teach our children? Well, I've got a grandson who lives on the West Coast who's been told that, well, you don't have to believe in this religiously, but it's a nice cultural event. And every Shabbos they give you pizza at the end of the service. So he'll remember pizza, which is not a bad thing to remember. But what do you do with the fourth generation? Well, if our identification is growing increasingly weaker, then we've got a problem. But I think this generational transmission is a real thing. The sensitivity of people, what's there to say about that? Some are more sensitive than others. There's always what Bellows said, high IQ morons too. We have to be concerned about them. But if we're to take seriously Abraham's response to God, Hineni, here I am, do with me as you will, well, the succeeding generations are essentially saying that in their own idiom, in their own way. That's no answer, of course not. But what else do we have to say? If you refuse your inheritance, it makes you less fully human, I think. So what you have to do is say, what do I do with this? How do I move forward? How can I continue? And I need to continue. I can run, but I can't hide. So, fourth generation, some works are beginning to appear. It's still a little early for that, but they will come. I'm sure they will come. I don't know when or how, or there'll be films, there'll be poetry, there'll be short stories, there'll be novels. Jews are people of the book, or someone once said, the Book of the Month Club. So I think it's important for Jews to continue, obviously. How they do this is another issue. I just don't know how they'll do it, but they'll do it.
We got one here. We got a question.
Thank you so much for this amazing remarks. Before we leave, I wanted to say we're here with Living Links, which is a new organization specifically to engage the third generation. And we actually have a training program to equip grandchildren to keep their grandparents' stories alive in all different media. And so I'm looking forward to incorporating so much of your research and expertise into the continuous development of this. And if there are any descendants in the room who are interested in participating in this and being part of that transmission of this inheritance, check out Living Links.
Thank you so much. Good luck to you.
I have one over here. Hi. So as a second generation, this is more of an observation. We came of age and became adults when our parents were first becoming comfortable speaking about it. And I remember I attended a conference and we kind of said our parents are not ready to hand us the microphone. They were talking. And most of us learned from watching our parents' testimonies if they gave it or at home. I was fortunate that I got to travel with my father, who you knew, respected you and considered you a friend, to Poland twice and help him write his memoir. But I feel that, before, as it's being handed down, for second generation, we've been a little bit failed. There's not been infrastructure, not a gathering, not a training. People contact me. I've been very involved. I'm an ambassador for the Arlson Archives. And now we have all this new material, camp lists and documents, which are not being incorporated into the Shoah testimonies. They're kind of, finished and put away. So I think there's been a lack of energy or drive to really empower the second generation now and say, go to the camps, learn, research the family history, continue to uncover and discover and build upon it, how to go and speak at schools or school boards. We just in South Lake addressed for the second year 4,000 students. And so, because there aren't enough museums in the country to serve all the small towns and communities. So I think that, yes, for third generation and fourth, it's important, but I think for second generation, if we don't learn that we have to organize, there's never been a national gathering, not even a convention or a conference, to take the energy. And so that's my one point that has made me realize this is a struggle. And the second thing is, the challenge of fiction. and how that's now not just Holocaust fiction, but romance is now incorporating Jews hidden in the farmland who are handsome. And so I think there's a lot of things going against us, and before we look so far down the road toward fourth generation, I think there's a lot of second generation right now. This is the ideal time. They have income, they have free time to try, and I wish someone would harness us and put them together and empower us to realize that we have a voice. A lot of us know more and could learn more and I have all my father's camp lists. They're very powerful when you discover these things that were not available. There were no computers when my dad was doing his work, so thank you.
Well, thank you. I will challenge one thing you said. There has been a second generation conference in New York City about, I don't know, 25 years ago now, but, or more. Well, it's never too late. So I think the second generation has made an impact, those that choose to make it. And I think that Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust, in which she goes to different countries and interviews these children, is very important work that still can be studied with success. One of the people that she interviews was never told that her parents were survivors. You know, the survivors usually fall into one of two groups. Those who can't stop talking about it and those who can't start talking about it. And it depends which group you are in. And also, how did you survive? Were you a camp inmate? Were you doing things that were you ashamed of? Or were you one of the partisans who fought back? It depends what your experience was, how you relate to your own children, and what they learn and what they take away from that issue. But I couldn't agree more that more needs to be done. The second generation probably started to come of age in the 70s and early 80s, and books, poetry, films started to appear. I think, let's not sell that generation short. Could more have been done? Sure. More always could have been done. But let's not lose sight of what was done. I think that's important. Thank you.